Anyway, thank you for being here tonight. We can't thank you enough. This is our Macabre Michigan Tales. The first time we're doing this event. Maybe it'll become an annual event. It's a possibility. So we have three, instead of 4 authors represented tonight. Our one gal, Michelle Roger, called with a horrendous something or other, and she didn't even sound socially acceptable on the phone, so she won't be with us tonight. And I really didn't feel like, well, whatever she's got, maybe I shouldn't pick her books up and bring them. So, but she is available at Barnes & Noble and online, and I do have some little sales receipts made up if you're interested in her books. She writes, her books are about the legends of a spirit of Belial. And so there's 2 books, Terror Under the Lupin Moon, and the next one is, the Curse of some princess. I'm sorry, I don't have it all written down. I left my notes at home though. So that didn't do us any good. But they're paperbacks, they're not long novels, they're 103, 124 pages. Michelle also is an author of young adult books, and she does children's books, and this rather macabre gory stories. And these are not her first attempts at this genre, so she has a whole list of stories. What can I say about Michelle? She's also our local harp and violin teacher. So you may have had her playing a lovely Irish harp or a concert harp, and then on her other side, she writes gore. So anyway, that's enough about Michelle. But tonight we have these other great authors here. Allen Smyth, and we'll call you BR. All right, Bates and Gerald. Jerry. Okay, Jerry. They collaborated on their book. Now, so they're Michigan authors, Michigan stories, and each one is a little different. I've read those books, a lot of detail, and it's a lot of research. Theirs is rather much more gory than Allen's book. Allen has another thing, and he just twists the tale. And anyway, you gotta have these books. Yeah. And who wants to go first? Allen, you're first. And Allen will tell you a little bit about him and a little about his story. And like he said, I've read both of these books, so that's why they're here.
Hi. Hello. Good talk. We don't sit at the front table, but they talk. You'll have to excuse me. I'm trying not to walk like Joe Biden. I don't take that politically. I don't care one way or the other about candidates. I just wish that Joe Biden weren't almost as old as I am. Anyways, thank you for coming. Thanks, Diane, for having me, for including me in this presentation. I'm going to do 3 parts. The first part will be some biographical facts about me, but only as they relate to the book. If you knew me, you wouldn't want to know everything. You wouldn't. Then for the second part, we'll talk about the book itself, and if there are any questions after that, we'll try to answer them. First, the bio. I was born in Detroit, and I've lived in or near the city all my life. except for a couple of years in the Navy. And I now live in Brighton, Michigan. The only reason this is of consequence is that I decided, when I decided to write a book, that I wanted to write it about Detroit. I wanted Detroit to be part of it. And so you'll recognize some of the stuff in the book if you read the book. Streets and locations and so forth. At least if you will if you've been here for a while. When we talk about the book in a minute, you'll see what I mean. I live with my wife, Marilyn. That's Marilyn over there. And we've been married for a long time, 61 years, which is long enough to have a daughter who is retired from federal law enforcement. If you're married for a long time, you might have a child who is retired. One of the characters in the book, Maggie Foster, was intended to be like Becca. She was designed to be, Becca was the prototype, so to speak, of the character. But as you'll see, Maggie evolved, and she's not like Becca at all as she ended up. She looks like Becca. She still looks like Becca. I didn't change her looks. But other than that, she's not like Becca at all. We also have a son, Eric, who's not in the book. Not because he's any less important to us, but simply because he's not the kind of person you'd put in a book. He's a good guy. He lives about a drive and a 5-iron from here, real close, just on the other side of M59. Whoops, skipped something. Now, as you've probably figured out, I'm retired. I was an ad man for most of my working life. Not ever on the creative side, however. Always on the business side, account, service, and marketing planning mostly. This plays into why I decided to write the book. I wanted to do something creative, just to see if I could. Now we start the segue into the book itself kind of gradually. One of the things people ask me is why I decided to write a book. And there were several reasons, and I'm not exactly sure which is the main reason. So what I tell people is just what I just said, just to see if I could. That was certainly a factor. When it first came into my head to write a book about 30 years ago, I thought it was a fun idea. But I also thought I'd never go through with it. I'd never actually finish a whole book because I had a characteristic about me, a bad characteristic about me, is that I have lots of big ideas and I seldom follow through on big ideas. But this time I did. I followed through, and I assumed at the time that I didn't know how to write a book. And it turned out I was right. I didn't know how to write a book. So I had to learn how. And that's the reason it took me so long to write the book. I started writing about 14 years ago. And I finished about 4 years ago. Yeah, about 4 years ago. Which means that it took about 9 or 10 years to write the book. And because I actually started putting words on paper in 1919. I mean in 2010. That's the other thing about being old, is you mix up centuries. I started writing the book in 2010, and I finished in 2019. And in that time, I learned a lot about how to write a book of fiction. In 2009, or thereabouts, after having a few too many cocktails, I told a couple people people who I had a lot of regard for in terms of this kind of thing, that I was thinking about writing a book. They wanted to know what I was going to write about. And up until that point, the whole thing was in my head. The whole book was in my head, or most of it was in my head. And they wanted to know what I was going to write about, so, by the way, they were also a little bit overserved at the time. Anyway, I told them about the characters I had in my mind and the plot, and they encouraged me to get on with it. It would be accurate to say, in their somewhat inebriated state, that they were wildly enthusiastic. So I started. Now, what's the book about? Well, when I first started to think about it 30 years ago, I only knew a couple things. I wanted the hero, who's also called the protagonist, for anybody who's not in the writing business, to be an everyman, sort of like myself, like you. Not a typical hero, no special powers, not a Superman or other fantasy characters, more a Mr. Rogers type. Someone the readers would like, of course, but only because he was like them, or like how they thought they were. And I thought something would happen to him to make him believe he had to do something of consequence, something extraordinary, something an everyman wouldn't do. So that's where I started. Let me read something to you. I hope I have it here. Yes. There was a writer about 100 years ago named H.L. Mencken. Now, most of you have heard about H.L. Mencken. He was a newspaper man and prolific writer. He was also a literature critic, a well-regarded critic of literature. And in describing the basics of a well-written novel, he said, and I'll read to you, "Tell a man's story of his struggle with his fate." Now, first of all, this was in 1920 that he wrote this, or 1930. And that's when they didn't care about being equally attentive to women. So he only thought about men. So he said, "Tell a man's story of his struggle with his fate. Show the ebb and flow of his ideas and ideals and the multitude of forces shaping them, which gives in brief the story of a human being driven, tortured, and fashioned by the blood within him and the world without. Give it a beginning, a middle, and an end, and some reasonable theory of existence overall." That's where I started. That's when I first started learning how to write a novel. Then I started to write a novel, and then I learned a little bit more, and I had to go back and rewrite what I'd written. And then I learned a little bit more, and I had to go back and rewrite what I'd written, and I learned a little bit more, and so forth. And it went on like that for pretty much for 9 years. So we'll talk specifically about the book now. For anyone wondering, I can say up front, it's not a Western, even though it's called The Lone Ranger Card. And it's not a children's book, even though there's a period in the beginning of the book about a little boy. It's a murder mystery. Now it opens with a school shooting scene. Horrible, horrible thing. However, it's not a massacre. The shooter has a specific target in mind when he approaches the school with a gun in his hand. His wife. She's a school teacher at the school. The school is Northville High School, about 10 miles from here. Maybe more than that, but I think it's about 10 miles. The first of several local landmarks. The shooter's crazy, of course. Crazy as in brain damaged from an automobile accident. He suffers from a kind of PTSD. Then in the second chapter, that's the first chapter. Something happens in the first chapter, and it has to do with the school shooting. Then, oh, by the way, this book has lots of twists and turns in it. And my description of the book here will be limited to the point where I'm trying not to give anything away, okay? Which is kind of hard to do. Then in the second chapter, it's 14 years later. We have two men, one in his early 60s and the other about 10 years younger. They're having lunch in a local restaurant, a fast food restaurant, the White Castle in Canton on Ford Road near Haggerty. The older man is talking. His name is Pete. He's telling the younger man, Dylan, that he has put together a plan to assassinate a United States Supreme Court justice. And Pete says, I need your help. We quickly find out that Pete and Dylan are longtime friends, very good friends, and Dylan is an ex-Navy SEAL. The two reasons: he's a good friend and he can trust him, and he's an ex-Navy SEAL, why Pete has chosen Dylan as his accomplice. Now, I should explain to you that Pete is the protagonist, the hero. Dylan is a sidekick, so to speak. So Dylan is stunned, of course. He's beyond stunned. He's dumbfounded because Pete is not an assassin. Dylan thinks of him as the kindest, gentlest man he knows. What the hell? Dylan has left his Navy SEAL days behind him, way behind him. He simply can't believe the words coming out of Pete's mouth. His first thought is, sometime between now and when this event is supposed to take place, I have to talk Pete into abandoning his plan. Dylan can't just say no. He owes too much to Pete. Pete has done a great deal to help him succeed in life. Pete, by the way, is our protagonist, as I said, our everyman hero. During this lunch, Pete does two other things. He offers to pay Dylan $1 million for his help. Now, as you read the book, you'll see that Dylan has several problems, and he needs the money. Has anybody read the book, by the way? Anybody? Okay. So you'll have an opportunity to do that if you want. If I properly describe it to you. As you read the book, you'll see that Dylan has several problems. One of them is that he needs the money. Pete also tells Dylan he's going to put the whole thing in writing. All the reasons he's come to the conclusion he has to do this, and how he plans to do it. He's going to write a journal for Dylan to read and for the world to help everybody understand why he's doing this. So we have a school shooting. 14 years later, a man says he's going to assassinate an important government official. Why? Well, that's what the book is about. A good friend of mine, after reading the book, called me and told me I'd written a fine why done it. He also said he'd read it in 2 sessions because he had to find out how it came out. There's also the issue of whether he goes through with it, whether Pete goes through with it. Because the book is full of twists and turns. Now, I'm going to read a couple paragraphs to help explain the title. If you can imagine, in the journal that Pete is writing, he's telling everything. And he decides that in order to tell everything, I have to really go back to my childhood. And you find out that in his childhood, his grandfather was a significant influence on him in a positive way. His grandfather taught him all the good things that he knows about life. Now, he and his grandfather is committed to him, by all means. He and his grandfather are sitting watching television in 1957. So it's a 16-inch screen in 1957. It's probably a GE or a Philips or something like that. What was the other? Zenith. Zenith was a big name at that time. Or an Admiral. Admiral was another big name. It was one of those sets. And they're sitting in the living room, and he's sitting on his grandfather's lap. Now, his grandfather's a big man, so we got this little 7-year-old boy who's sitting on one side of his lap. And at the other side, the grandfather is listening, is watching and listening to the program, which is the Lone Ranger. At one point, things change. And I'm going to read exactly from the book so that you will know what happened. Now, it's in the beginning of the book, so I'm not going to give away too much here. To Grandpa, the Lone Ranger became the best of all heroes, resolving the problem of the little people by vanquishing the bad guys and expecting nothing in return. Nothing in the way of gratitude or recognition, just riding off and leaving a silver bullet behind. Not to mention he was handsome and rode a beautiful white horse and wore a white hat. Now here's the weird part, and this is Pete talking. The part that stuck with me. Grandpa said it at the end of one of the shows in the second year and repeated it to me numerous times thereafter. He lifted and turned me in his lap to face him. All of a sudden, he was very serious. He said, "Petey, someday you're going to be a Lone Ranger. You're going to be in a situation where you have to do something very difficult. So difficult, nobody else will do it. But you will, because it has to be done. And it'll be the right thing to do." Now, that's not something a little boy forgets real fast, like maybe never. So that's what the Lone Ranger card is. The rest of the book is so full of twists and turns that I will reveal too much by talking any more about it. So now I'll answer your questions, providing they don't have to do with how the book comes out. Any questions? Yes.
You said that you had the whole book in your head. Now, as you went through writing the book, did it fluctuate or?
Oh yes, it changed. Keep in mind, this happened over almost 25 years, the whole process, from the time I first thought about it. And the first ideas that I came up with never even appear anymore in the book. So yes, every night I would sort of rock myself to sleep thinking about the book and thinking about the plot and how am I going to resolve that particular issue. And I'm a person who believes in realism in books. If a book is not realistic, I stop reading it right away. If a character is not realistic, or if the action is not realistic, or if it's a fantasy book, I don't read fantasy books. Maybe I should, but I don't. In any case, it has to work for me. And so that's what I did every night for like 10 or 12 years until I finally came up with a story. Well, I was coming up with a story during the 10 or 12 years. And I got to the point where I thought I had a story. Now, even in the next 10 years, I was changing the story. But I knew the people, I knew the characters, and that's the other thing. You become, when you're writing a book, if you've ever done it, you become involved with the characters. They become real, and that's a very difficult thing to do at times, because sometimes you might have to kill off a character, and Anyways, so the answer is yes. Definitely changed it.
Follow. How much sleep did you get that?
Oh, I got a lot of sleep. That's what made me think that the book wasn't any good, because it put me to sleep every night. And I was thinking, nobody will pay any attention to this book. Yes, sir.
Once you had your draft, what did you do to approach publishers to get it printed? How difficult was that?
Well, first of all, you have to realize that I am very old. By that, I'm 83 years old. Once I had written the book and rewritten it and rewritten it and rewritten it and thought I had something close to a final version of the book, I started to send manuscripts to agents. And I got polite responses. Sometimes I got no response at all. But I didn't do that a lot. I sent out about 8 or 10. You'll talk to authors, or you'll read about authors who said that before I got my first book published, I sent out 200 or 300 or whatever the number may be. And I sent out 8 or 10. And I was in a creative reading group, and they knew more than I did about all this stuff. And but I also was doing a lot of stuff on my own, investigating online and so forth. Somebody in that group, and 2 or 3 people that agreed with him right away, said, well, if you get an agent tomorrow, your book won't be published for 2 years. If it's published at all. So I went home and thought about it. I said, screw this, I'm going to publish it myself. So that's what I did. I published it on Amazon. Then, however, and I had a whole bunch of ideas for how I would launch the book and introduce it to people. Then COVID came. And there was no launch. Nothing happened. Now, the book did sell a little bit. Primarily through word of mouth of people who read it. And the unfortunate thing is it didn't sell enough because they would very often take their copy and give it to somebody instead of telling them to buy it. But anyways, that's the answer. The answer is yes, I did. And I think I learned a lot about the publishing business. And basically, it's not a very good business. First of all, the people on the other side of that publishing business aren't making a lot of money. They're not making a lot of money, so you can't blame them for the decisions they make that may not be in favor of your book. Especially if you're old and they're not going to get any more books out of you, or maybe they're only getting 1 or 2. No, but if you're 25 years old and you show some promise, they'll be interested in you because they may get 30 or 40 or 50 books out of you. Yes, sir.
Question, since you wrote this over decades, did the decades change your perspective of the characters, since every decade comes up with different social norms?
I found that I've gone way over my time.
Oh.
But the answer to your question is, yes, decades change things. What's going on in the rest of the world changes what's going on in your book. Not as much as I thought, but at the first idea I had, when 3 or 4 years later, when I realized it was a dumb idea because all of a sudden that issue was going away, so I did change it because of that. I have to tell you and warn you about one thing about this book. It tries very hard to stay away from politics, but there's one political point of view in the book, and that is that it favors the side of gun control versus gun rights. And it doesn't say that guns are bad or anything like that. It just says that there are certain things about the battle between the gun control people and the gun rights people wasn't coming out the way our hero wanted it to come out. So that's when he decided to do something about it, to do something else about it. Are we done? We should have.
We're out of time. Remember, we're 100 now.
Oh, yeah, we're 100. That's all right.
Is
Are there any more questions?
I think the
Oh,
majority.
yeah, okay, fine.
Yeah, would you recommend joining a creative writing group?
Yes. They're hard to find. Good ones are really hard to find. There are lots of creative writing groups around, and they last for a couple of months because they break up right away, or they're not. When you get there, you find that the same people are there, the same 7 people are there, and one of them writes kind of books that you have no interest in. Another one, you can't understand what he's saying because he's a little crazy. Another one, and so forth and so forth and so forth. There are all kinds of different people in writing groups, but you got to do it. You got to do it. I mean, I don't say you got to do it, but I think it helps a lot.
Any more questions?
I think we're up. The sign over here says $16.99. It's $16.